Hello and welcome once again to Code Completion. We are a group of iOS developers and educators hoping to share what we love most about development, Apple technology, and completing your code on this brand new show. My name is Dimitri and I'll be your host once again for this episode, and I'm joined by my fellow completionists, Spencer.
Hi.
Fernando.
Hello, hello.
And Johnny.
Hey everyone.
So first off, Johnny, can you tell us a bit more about your pain points going between different versions of Xcode and keeping your code compatible?
Yeah, so this is a topic that I was thinking a lot about, especially during this time of year for developers. It's a really exciting but busy time, right? Because we go into July, watch the WWDC keynote, and there's so many cool features that we're like looking forward to working on and excited to use. And then late August rolls around and you realize, oh wow, I should actually probably put those features into my app if I want to, get them in at the time of the release. And obviously this is, more, if you're releasing on a more regular schedule, then if you're releasing on a more regular schedule, then this is you want to meet these deadlines, right? So in order to use the new APIs, you generally have to do those on an Xcode beta. But if you still want to be able to release versions of your app previous to the actual release of iOS 14, then you will need to make sure that your code compiles on both Xcode 11 and Xcode 12, which is sort of annoying as a developer because you get so excited to use these features. You start submitting new versions of your app to test flight. But if you actually want to make like a production build and put it in the App Store, you still have to be able to build and archive with Xcode 11. So Apple has provided a way for us to sort of deal with these two situations. First off, they have the availability condition. Anytime you want to use an API that is not that does not exist, or I guess that is only available in iOS 14, you have an availability condition, which is usually prefixed by just like an if pound available. You put in the platform name, the version number, and then an asterisk. And it's really nice because the compiler will usually tell you if you need that. If your app supports previous versions of iOS, then it will warn you and tell you that you need an availability condition. The problem is that if you're working on Xcode 12, the compiler thinks that the API exists and doesn't have any issues with it. So one thing that you'll have to remember that won't necessarily be caught by the debugger is that you're using that you put a compiler check on it. Which this one's the syntax for it is somewhat similar, but you begin with the pound and then if compiler and then check the compiler version, which if you're using any APIs that are for iOS 14 only, the compiler version is 5.3. So you will need to add a compiler flag in order to sort of get your build to ignore all of that code that you added that's only available in Xcode 12, so that it's ignored in Xcode 11. Anyway, I hope I'm explaining myself, but this is one thing that we have to learn as we get into this time of like using betas, is that if you actually want to continually push out new versions of your app in this period in between betas and whatnot before the actual release of iOS 14, you'll need to add compiler checks as well as availability conditions for the version if you want your app to still be able to release your app.
When do you do cleanup for all of that? Like if you go through the whole process, you release the app, when do you go back and remove all the compiler checks?
Yeah, so as soon as the gold master for Xcode 12 is available, we can remove all of those checks, because then we can all officially move on to Xcode 12. And really, it's just a rule, some arbitrary rule that Apple has that you can't release a build that's been archived by Xcode 12, because then it would have all of the APIs within it that are not actually available, right? So, we're adding a bunch of widgets to day one, and we want people to actually test those out before we actually release the version. So we have to compile with a non-gold master of Xcode 12, and you can put those up in test flight, but we wouldn't actually be able to release those as actual builds. Any build that you want to release still needs to be compiled by a gold master version of Xcode, which at this point is 11.6, I think. So yeah, so you kind of have to work in both Xcode lands if you want to both have test flights for iOS 14, but still want to be able to release for iOS 13 or previous.
This problem is actually kind of exacerbated by doing Mac development as well, because oftentimes you have to release back several years worth of macOS versions, and you have to maintain compatibility all throughout. Now, this is usually fine if you're just on the latest Xcode on your development machine, but as soon as you need a test on an older Mac OS, you might have extra Mac Minis laying around or a VM, then it's a little bit difficult because you can't just deploy to an older version of the operating system and debug that. Like with Xcode, you can always plug in an older device and you have the full debugger available to you for iOS. But for macOS, you actually have to go and put Xcode on that older computer, which can be a little bit difficult. Now, one thing that does work that I've used quite a bit is to compile your app using the latest and greatest, bring it over along with your code to an older version of the OS, and then you can debug it there and still get line-by-line debugging, even though that version of Xcode has no clue how to compile it, because you can't always have like those compiler checks, especially if you're not using Swift and you're down to Objective-C. So instead of having code that's just not compiled, because it is compiled into the program, that's what gets you the behavior that you're seeing. It's just you're skipping over that part at runtime. So those are things that you can do on the macOS side as well. Spencer, have you used these availability checks at all?
Yeah, I have. I've been working on kind of a personal side project for sort of this I guess you'd call it like a home audio amplifier, and it's a Vapor app, but I wanted to run it on a Raspberry Pi specifically because I didn't want to use my only Mac Mini just to really control one thing. It uses a serial port to kind of communicate to the amp, and I wanted to make it be able to communicate, and I could just make an iOS app and control it that way. The problem is the first library that I used to try to kind of interface with the serial connection was an open source library called Swift Serial, and it's meant for both iOS and Linux, and that's kind of why I chose it over probably the better like solution of like ORS serial port, but it's only a macOS compatible library at this time. So in there, I was trying to mess around with a few of the different ways that it was connecting to the serial port, and in there it does things like that, where it says, hey, if the operating system is Mac OS, you can use these arguments or these flags to set up the file descriptor. Otherwise, use a couple different ones in order to make it compatible both ways. So it's definitely something that I think we should all know how to use, and I think it's interesting, Johnny, that you brought up both not just using the if available for like a version of Mac OS or something, but even checking down to the compiler and saying like, does we should probably also check those as well in certain situations. So definitely something that if you haven't seen it come up, it will likely come up sometime for you in many different places.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dimitri, kind of on the topic of Vapor, were you going to talk about sort of your experience with using Swift for web development? I don't know if it was specifically about Vapor, but kind of in that realm, more or less.
Yeah, so I've actually been doing a lot of Swift development on the server, and I wanted to talk about those experiences because I think it's pertinent to a lot of developers nowadays that know Swift and want to maybe get into server development, but they don't necessarily know what kind of steps they can take to get in. So one thing that I started with was John Sundell's Publish framework, which is a static site generator for Swift websites that basically will turn a bunch of markdown files and resources into a full-fledged website that you can then go ahead and publish anywhere you want. So this framework is very easy to use, and it's very much built for Swift users. So basically, you can go ahead and directly modify the themes. You can generate HTML using Swift code directly, so you don't have to have as much guesswork with how to structure your nodes and things like that. And you can reuse components very easily across multiple different pages or in different situations. It's kind of a shame that you can't do the same with like CSS. You still have to manually write CSS, so you still need to know about how websites are put together to be able to use something like this, but it definitely makes it much simpler. Now, something that I went ahead and did is I'm also going ahead and using GitHub Actions to actually deploy our site every time we put up a pull request and that pull request gets merged. It actually does get merged directly. GitHub will go ahead and download our site's code. It will download Publish, it will compile everything, and it will generate everything and put it in a completely different repo that is then served using GitHub Pages. So that's how codecompletion.io is actually put together. We just modify a few markdown files, submit a pull request, and then that Swift code will get run on the background. Now, like, that's only one side of web development, like making a website, but there's also the side where you want to make more in-depth APIs to be able to do more complex things, and that's where Vapor really comes in. So Vapor is a web framework that allows you to set up an API essentially with various routes where if you've ever consumed an API, you know that you can just go ahead and access certain URLs and things will happen whether you send information to it or you're just retrieving. All of that information is directly available. So using Vapor, you can use quite literally the same model code that you're using in your app directly on the server, and that is quite fun to use. Now, unfortunately, that comes with some new APIs that you probably never used, and that includes promises and futures, and those are quite complicated to get just right. So Spencer, I know you've been doing some Vapor development for quite a while, and even before Vapor 4, so what are your thoughts on a lot of these technologies?
Yeah, server-side Swift development just in general has always been something that I've really loved. I've always loved the idea of it, and I began learning Vapor. It was probably a few months after Vapor 3 came out. I just think it's a really fun thing that we are able to, as iOS or macOS developers, we can also go on the side of the server and build a backend for us, and we don't have to use a service like Firebase or some even CloudKit, I suppose, although I think CloudKit's a lot better than Firebase. We don't have to be necessarily limited to the functionalities that they have, but then we can kind of jump over and, like you said, have a lot more kind of flexibility and be able to literally write any routes that we want, have any custom integrations. Built in is support for things like having a SQLite, MySQL database, Postgres. I think they're adding MongoDB. So there are a lot of developments within Vapor that are making it very powerful. You can send things to Amazon S3, and because it's all open source, anyone can kind of contribute middleware or other libraries that will kind of extend the functionality of it. And it's been something that I've made a couple Vapor projects for my job at Lambda School. Like if one of the APIs that we use, one of the public APIs we use goes down, then I've got a backup. And just, it's really kind of an exciting thing as an app developer to also be able to kind of go more full stack, if you kind of want to use that term, of also building your backend as well. And the best part is we're using Swift. There's not another language that you have to use. You don't have to use, JavaScript and the 1 million different, libraries and dependencies they use, and they seem to switch every other month or so. So in that sense, I think it's a really exciting thing. The more I can use Swift, the better, basically, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just Swift. Like being able to use Xcode in that sort of environment is tremendously beneficial. So a lot of web developers do have tools to go ahead and debug and rate the performance of their web applications, but not many developers actually know how to use those tools because they're frankly hard to use. It's often a lot of setup to get just right, and you can't just go ahead and use them on a running instance. It's a lot of work to get it going. Now, the nice thing about Vapor is it's quite literally a Swift package that you have. Your whole site is a Swift package that you can then go ahead and run in Xcode. This includes breakpoints. You want to know when your route gets hit, you just go ahead and set a breakpoint on that route, and everything will stop at that point, and you can go ahead and inspect everything. You can go ahead and manipulate how your code is running, and manipulate the internal state of your application just by changing things in Xcode. So if you have your app and your server running side by side in two Xcode projects, that is tremendously beneficial for the whole process of development, because you can get up and running that much quicker. Fernando, have you used these sorts of things before? Okay, I think Fernando's having slad technical difficulties.
Yeah, I can't hear him either.
Okay, so one more thing that is important to think about when using Vapor. So although it is quite performant even right now, to the point where it won't be the first choice for many web development projects, because it is not necessarily something that's traditionally been the language of choice for doing web development. Something you do need to keep in mind is that it's not complete. There are missing pieces that might be the downfall to the project that you're working in. So for instance, it can't stream files. So if you wanted to write a video streaming site, you just won't be able to do it with Vapor. It won't support things like HLS. That said, because it is all in Swift, and because you have Xcode, you can set a breakpoint at any point and see how Vapor works, which is tremendously useful when you want to go ahead and jump in and hack together the framework, so that way you can go ahead and do more interesting things. Spencer, I know you submitted a PR for Vapor directly, and it was as easy as finding an issue that someone had and adding that missing functionality. Sometimes no one has the time to just add it, so if you do have the time, you can just jump in and add something really simple. I myself have added a few things to Vapor as well, and these were direct needs that I needed for work. Like I needed the ability to connect directly to a Unix socket, and that wasn't in Vapor, but it was part of Swift Neo, so I was able to just plug in that functionality. It was a few lines, and then some cleanup to write tests and things like that. So that is another benefit, that if you are just getting started in this industry and you want to get a bit more experience, there are open source projects like this where you can just jump in and you can go ahead and add functionality and be part of a community that can help get you more opportunities in the future.
Yeah, it was a really cool thing. Like Dimitri was kind of really the one that pushed me to do it, and I'm really glad that he did. One of us, I can't remember who, I think it was Dimitri, just looked on, the issues page of Vapor's repo on GitHub and said, oh, hey, this is like a super quick fix. And I was like, oh yeah, I'll go ahead and do that. I literally added the app discardable result attribute to a function, and that was it. It was a single part of a line of code, but it was something that like someone found annoying. And even just last night, I was actually working on a Vapor app myself, and you can actually have the Vapor app perform requests, to another API, for example. And the way that we did that was, or the way that you do that is you've kind of got two options. You have a very simple one. You say, go to this URI and that's it. Or you have one that says, go to this URI, here are some headers and kind of a closure for setup. And I was like, well, I just want headers. I don't want to do that closure. So I'm going to submit a pull request here in the next day or two to just try to kind of have an in between there. And it's really not hard. And I think, like Dimitri said, the key there is you don't have to do anything crazy to, submit a pull request. You don't have to make this amazing feature, but it can be really simple. And, just getting used to that process of submitting pull requests in the way that they kind of want it to be. The whole code contribution generally is going to be some contribution document. That's a really cool thing to do. If anything, you can say that you contributed to an open source project, and that could look good on resumes. And if anything, just for your own satisfaction of like, hey, you know what, I am contributing to the community. That's a cool thing, and I'm planning on kind of doing that more and more for sure.
Hello.
And
we can hear you now.
Fernando's back.
Yes, I am
Do
back.
you have any thoughts
Welcome
on
back.
all this, Fernando?
Yeah.
No, keep going. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. So no. It's a really really interesting topic to me. I've been following it, I think, since Vapor came out, because I always like telling people that my favorite repo is actually Robbie Hansen's Cocoa HTTP server. Because when I discovered it, it was like, it totally blew my mind that he was doing web stuff on Objective-C. At the moment, we didn't have Swift when I discovered it, or it was basically very, very new. So it was really, really amazing. Like, I wouldn't say I'm. How can I put this in a way that doesn't make me look bad? I hate learning other languages. So when I discovered that I could do everything in Objective-C, like everything I wanted, of course, which was iPhone, macOS, and web on Objective-C, I was like, wow, this is heaven. And then Vapor came out, which was pretty good. Swift is amazing. But yeah, I've been following it for a long, long time, and I think in general, I'm very, very excited about the possibilities of this. Like, we're just getting started, and I can definitely see positions in maybe 5 or 10 years where it's like we have a backend based on Vapor, like come and work for us. So I think that's just amazing.
And that's actually what I'm building at my job. I'm building an entire backend infrastructure using Vapor, and mostly for the performance benefits, because it is a compiled language that when you build in release mode, Swift is fast. So Swift is slow in debug mode because it has to go ahead and double check everything and make sure that you're not doing anything silly. But in release mode, it kind of removes a lot of those checks in the optimization phase, so it gets a lot faster as a result, which is
I'm really
nice.
curious as to how you managed to do that. Like actually selling the project or selling the fact that you could do the backend on Vapor. Like, can you give me any insight on that?
That's a topic for another time, unfortunately.
That makes sense. I think episode 4. Yeah, I'll bring it up as my topic then.
Awesome. So Spencer, you were talking about getting started as a junior developer and contributing to open source projects. But there's another aspect to being a junior developer and getting started, and that is tutorial hell. Can you talk a bit about this?
Yeah, this is something that in my day-to-day job as an instructor, I see this all the time. And I just remember being in this similar situation as the students that I'm teaching right now, where it doesn't happen to all of them for sure, but what I will see and what I'll kind of see as a somewhat common, I suppose, situation is you've got this person that wants to learn programming. They try to do it on their own for a while, from anywhere from a few months to even a few years, and for whatever reason, they can't do it themselves, and that's not any fault of their own. But there's this concept of tutorial hell, which is like, I am going to try to do this on my own. I'm gonna, follow this tutorial from maybe Ray Wenderlich or whoever. It doesn't really matter where it's from, but it's some tutorial to learn X thing, like how to perform a segue or how to set up a table view or whatever it is. And the issue is the sort of the hellish part of it is once you finish the tutorial, you're like, sweet, I feel awesome about this. where do I go from here, right? And it's sort of this, how do I progress from the next step of like, okay, I finished this. How do I feel comfortable with doing this and implementing it in maybe a different way or into my own code? That's where I think this gap is just really hard to get past, and something that, you know, is on my mind all the time as an instructor. Like, what is the best way to get past that? And I think something that I've seen both from personal experience and through kind of the lives of these students is, one, you just have to write code. You have to be doing something and try things out and in maybe different ways, or in putting it in a different project to see, okay, well, what are the similarities where when I put it in this project, how it looks the same or different or whatever. I also was talking to a student about this last week, and I thought, you know what? I remember trying to do this even with Vapor. I know this is like the main topic of the day is Vapor, but when I was trying to learn Vapor back in Vapor 3, I was following tutorials, but it doesn't really give you enough. And so what I did was I bought a book on Vapor, and then that gives you a much more sort of complete knowledge of the subject, rather than here is this step-by-step guide, but it's more of like, okay, let's go through all of these things, but you also get a more sort of in-depth amount of knowledge rather than the shallow, this is how you do this one thing, and then it becomes something where you're like, okay, because I know this, it can be applied in all of these different situations. So those are kind of my thoughts on, you know, how do you get that more complete, rounded out knowledge? I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts on like things that help you, or things that maybe you would recommend to people on how do you get out of this tutorial hell as maybe a beginner, or even as, you know, developers with all of the experience levels that we have. Johnny, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, so you bring up an interesting point, because I definitely felt when I first started development, I was like, oh yeah, I'm all about the tutorials, like Ray Wenderlich or whatever. Like, I can learn whatever I want. But then when it came to actually implementing it into a commercial app, it was like, well, yeah, if I was starting a project from scratch, like, sure.
Exactly.
But like, I'm trying to insert this one feature into this project that has millions of lines of code. Like, where in the world do I even put this? And I think the biggest thing, going along with what you said about buying the Vapor book, is learn how to read documentation. Like, learn how to read Apple's official documentation. Mm-hmm. Because there's sort of the application aspect of a feature or something that you want to add, the application aspect of an API. And then there's sort of like, what are the principles of how to use this? And that's all found in the documentation. Like, if you can get really, really good at reading and understanding documentation, and then actually like writing the code, that's when you'll really start to learn things. I mean, when I was a student, I remember opening up Apple's documentation and I didn't understand like a single word of what I was reading. And so I always wanted to go to the tutorials, because I was like, oh, this application of it makes much more sense. But the more that you can learn to turn to documentation and learn to understand it is when you're gonna like really just explode and be able to like do a ton of different things.
Yeah,
I think that's such an interesting thing. Oh, sorry. Go for it, Dimitri.
So, like, when I was just starting to learn how to program, and this was with Perl, so this was not with Swift, because Swift was not a thing, and I didn't know Objective-C was a thing at the time, and I just had a book on Perl, so I ran with it. It came with, like, 4 or 5 big projects that it would have you build, like, hand-holding style, and that's how I got started programming. Now, I was stuck for the longest time after that, because all I knew were those 4 or 5 different projects. I took one of them, it was a hangman game, and I like improved upon it, but I didn't have enough knowledge to kind of jump onto my own idea from that point forward. I had great ambitions, I tried, and I was like, okay, I don't know where to, like, what's my next step? I think at that point, what really helped me were those recipe style books. So these are books that kind of will just take one page and tell you about how to do something quick, something easy, something a few lines of code, and it usually gives you a little an image that shows you what the results are from doing that sort of thing. And that kind of allowed me to have a quick encyclopedia, if you will, that you can just look up, oh, I want to do this thing. Visually, you look for the thing you want to do, and then you can implement it without really understanding. And I think the key piece when you're just starting out is you don't need to understand. You just need to have as much exposure to as many different styles and ways of doing things that it just starts becoming natural without necessarily understanding why it's becoming, like why it works. Like we all use computers, and none of us, maybe Andrew, which we all know, but none of us are electrical engineers. We have no clue how the transistors work inside the computer. It's a black box to us. But we know how to manipulate the computer to do interesting things, which is what software is. So not necessarily having a complete understanding of something doesn't mean that you won't be able to use it. Oftentimes you'll be able to use it perfectly well. I mean, speakers of English, which all of us are, we don't necessarily know how the language works unless we took a course on linguistics. And even then, you are amazed that we are able to speak at all after learning how the language works in various different ways. We just absorb it naturally, and that's how our brains work. So you can use that same technique for learning code and learning many different things. And then once you have a significant amount of quote-unquote natural knowledge of something, you're able to just use it when you want to use it. Then you can go back and start understanding why those things work. And that can really reinforce what you've learned and allow you to see new possibilities that you may not have seen up until then. So you can kind of stop right before that point and you'll be fine. But if you do go back and reinforce everything and understand the why, then I think you're in a much better position to absorb that information because you wouldn't have absorbed it at the beginning. And you're in a much better position to use that new information to make new and interesting things. Fernando, what do you think?
I think Johnny, there's been I've been working on a project for a little while, just a little while, basically since maybe a month or two, which is exactly what Johnny said, which is I go through the tutorials, I think I know what I'm doing, and then I get to work, and then it's never all right. Just build a new app, build a new module, build a new thing. It's never like that. You're either super duper lucky where you go into a brand new job that's going to be very risky if they're building something new, or it's mid-level to higher level, mid to big-sized companies where you go into an existing code base and fix things, right? And sure, eventually, if you earn enough trust, you get into building features, but most of the time it's actually go and fix this, go and change this small thing. And it's really, really difficult to get into it. So what I've been thinking is, this is part of my book, which I won't expand. I'll make my topic next time. But it's a really interesting thing to go into, I keep rambling, sorry. If you go into GitHub and try and find open source projects, preferably MIT licensed, and digest their code, eventually you'll run into issues with that code. They don't do this right, they don't do that right. So what I'm trying to do is I'm picking up those pieces, small pieces of huge projects, like issues on GitHub, and I'm trying to build them out, refactor them, make them right, and then I'm packaging that up as a single lesson. I don't know if that makes sense. So it's not exactly like a tutorial. It's like, go and fix this, and once you think it's fixed, go and check the solution. And I think that's going to be valuable. But yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting thing. But we can discuss it later, I guess.
Not a problem. So this week's episode of Code Completion is once again brought to you by Hungry. So Hungry, that's Hungry with 3 U's, is the iPhone, iPad, and Apple Watch app you turn to when you really want to eat, but are blinded by the multitude of choices available to you, and your insatiable hunger. Hungry isn't here to help you discover new restaurants or flavors. No, it has a much more humble purpose. You tell it all about your favorite restaurants, and it will deploy its cryptographically advanced random number generator, invoked by shaking your phone in frustration, to make the decision of what to eat for you. Stuck at home in quarantine and sick of ordering pizza? Use Hungry. Did Hungry just suggest pizza again? Don't fret, as options for another cuisine, a cheaper option, something closer, or simply another option are just a button away. Hungry also comes with a collection of fun animated iMessage stickers, so you can share your hunger with others. Thanks again to Hungry for sponsoring our show. Search for Hungry, that's HUUUNGRY, on the App Store today to give it a try. So now that we're done with all of our topics, it's time for Complete the Code, where we quiz our listeners on your knowledge of Swift, Apple, and all things development. So on last week's episode, we asked you what was wrong with a particular piece of code that had an NS string. One of our listeners wrote in, David Wright, and he basically outlined it quite perfectly. So basically, if you use NSLog, sorry, I meant to say NSLog before, but I said NSString. But if you use NSLog and you pass in a format string, you need to be very careful that that format string does not include extra variables that might include extra tokens. So a token is anything with that % character in front of it. So by using string interpolation here, we are actually including another token by accident, potentially, if the name happens to have a % character in it. So if we have France Ferdinand, but France right in front of it, there's a % character, then that will kind of steal the variable that's part of our format string, and it will incorporate it there rather than within the age portion of it. So that's something you really need to be careful whenever you are using NSLog and format strings in general. Don't just use variables as your format string itself unless you know that it's going to have exactly the right amount of tokens. So never accept random user input. Otherwise, you're going to have a Bobby Tables situation on your hands if you've read the XKCD comic. So once again, thank you to David Wright for writing in their answer. And I think one thing they said at the end, which was quite funny, so I'll read it out, was that while it is highly unlikely that a person's name has a % symbol in it, let's not wait for Elon Musk to prove us wrong. So I thought that was the cherry on top of the answer. So thank you once again for writing that in. So for this week's prompt, we have the following code. So I want you to review it and tell us why might some developers discourage the pattern that we're going to explore below. So in a class conforming to UI table view data source, we have a method that returns a cell for a given index path. Since our cell is a custom cell type that we call date cell, we use a guard statement to dequeue a cell with identifier date cell and add a given index path, then optionally cast it to our custom type. If this cast fails for whatever reason, we simply return a newly initialized date cell, and we're done. But assuming our cell was successfully casted, we then assign its date property to the entry in a dates array corresponding to the index path row, then return the cell. So there's something that a senior developer might raise a red flag there. So go ahead and let us know what that something is, how you might go ahead and fix it. And be sure to use the hashtag #CompleteTheCode on Twitter, and the first person to write in will get a shout out on the show. And once again, our DMs are open on Twitter, so be sure to let us know if you have a quiz of your own that you'd like to share with our audience, and we'd be more than happy to have it on the show. So with all of that out of the way, it's time for compiler error. So this is a segment where I get to test my fellow completionists' knowledge about Swift, Apple, and all things development. So let's go ahead and get started. Now I do have a theme for today, and that theme is obscure Apple. Not obscure Apple, that was last week's. I was about to say last month. Our theme for today is programming languages that Apple has used over the years. So let me go ahead and bring over the 4 statements for this week. So we have the first one. Swift started its development as far back as 2010 as an evolution of the work Apple was already doing, improving the Objective-C language with features like automatic reference counting, zeroing weak references, and blocks. So statement number 2, available since the very first release of macOS 10, Java bindings to Cocoa called the Java Bridge were available to help bring new developers to the fledgling operating system all the way through macOS 10.4, which was the first release to introduce many new APIs not included in the Java bindings. Statement number 3, now at version 4.0, Objective-C was originally invented in 1984 by Brad Cox, and production versions did not even have a concept of manual reference counting as a part of the main runtime, or in Foundation Kit, even in NextStep 3.0. And statement number 4, Clascal was a language Apple developed for the Lisa Workshop development system as a version of Pascal with object-oriented features, and was supported in all versions of classic macOS as a way to make apps using the Mac app framework, also written in Clascal. So 3 of those statements are code completions, and 1 of them is a compiler error. Spencer, I see you smiling, so that means you must want to go first.
Oh, absolutely. No. The fact is, I have no idea on any of these things. My knowledge of even Objective-C is not what it should be, much less predating Objective-C. So as far as this goes, I wish we had like a phone a friend, in which case I would maybe phone Andrew Madsen, because he would definitely know all about any of this stuff here. I'm going to say, so my first thought is, this could be totally off. I'm kind of thinking that the number 2, the Java binding, sounds like something I've heard of before. Again, it could be something similar, like it was actually 10.3 that the first release happened where there were new APIs. I think I'm leaning towards either 1 or 4. Swift definitely could have started back as far as 2010. I don't know, but and then as far as Clascal goes, like that's just a total shot in the dark for me, so I have no clue. I've never heard of it, so I'm going to say that number 4 is the compiler error. But again, that's a total guess on my part here.
Great picking. So let's go with Johnny next.
Yeah, kind of same logic as Spencer. I'm not 100% sure, but number 4, I just never heard of Clascal, but I also realized that that I'm also not that old, and so it's possible that was a language that was widely used a long time ago. So yeah, I'll go with number 4.
Okay, Fernando?
Easy peasy. It's number 3.
Number
Ooh.
3.
Yes.
Do you have any reason why?
Yes. So I think I'm very, very confident that we are not in version 4.0 of Objective-C. At the very latest, we are at 2.1, but I'm pretty sure it's 2.0.
Okay, so let's take these in order. So Swift started its development as far back as 2010 as an evolution of the work Apple started doing, already improving Objective-C. And that's actually why they started making Swift, because they were making incremental improvements to Objective-C over the years. And as those improvements piled up, it was kind of better to start a new language rather than continually putting work into them. And Swift actually had its birthday not too long ago. I forget the exact date, but Chris Latner did go out and say that Swift, he is one of the only people that can claim more than 5 to 6 years of Swift experience, because it was indeed started as far back as 2010. So that is
July 17, 2010.
Yep. So that is indeed a code completion. Now for the next statement, we have available since the very first release of macOS 10, Java bindings to Cocoa called the Java Bridge were available to help bring new developers to the platform, but they were discontinued as early as 10.4. So it wasn't discontinued at that point, but new APIs were introduced to Cocoa that just were not available via the Java Bridge. And that is also a code completion. So Apple not only had a Java bridge, they also had a Ruby bridge that was included for a few years as Ruby on Rails kind of was becoming more popular. And then that one was also kind of sunset as soon as Swift kind of became popular. So Swift kind of took over and maybe we'll lose Objective-C bindings to the Objective-C frameworks one day. So that leads into Objective-C, which now at version 4.0, it was originally invented in 1984, and it did not actually have manual reference counting even in Next Step 3, which I found super fascinating. So Fernando, you had some doubts as far as what version the language was, and Apple has stopped sharing the marketing versions over the years, but the runtime is in fact at version 4.0. So if you can go ahead and download the runtime from Apple's open source project, and it's written in C++ and C and Objective-C, all three of those, and you can go ahead and explore that to the fullest if you'd like. But Objective-C is in fact at version 4.0. It's had a few more iterations since the 2.0 days, especially automatic reference counting and things like that, and zeroing weak references. So that points to number 4 being the compiler error, where Clascal was a language Apple did in fact develop for the Lisa Workshop development system. And this was an object-oriented version of Pascal. However, there is one problem in that apps back then, you could make them using the Mac app framework, which was also written in Clascal, but it was ultimately dropped during the PowerPC transition in 1994, the last supported version being macOS 8.1. So it did not stay around for the entire classic macOS era, and it was dropped eventually, especially with macOS 9, which was the last pillar of the classic macOS era. So you were not able to run Clascal apps after that point, especially on PowerPC hardware. So great job, everyone, at falling for my tricks once again.
What I find the most interesting, I know, right? What I find the most interesting is, as Fernando mentioned that, I was like, you know what? He's right. Objective-C definitely isn't at that. And I went to Wikipedia, and shockingly, Wikipedia lied to me. It said it was at version 2.
So it's interesting.
I learned my lesson here.
Yeah, I did the exact same thing, and Dimitri is still right, because Wikipedia is using 2.0, and that document, the source for that document comes from an Apple doc that was updated in 2009.
Oh, okay.
So if you go to the actual open source, I'll send the link, and we can share it on our Twitter. You will see that it's Objective-C 4. So I think that's amazing. I learned, so I learned. Thank you, Dimitri.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was amazingly hard to find that detail. I heard it in passing, like once upon a time on Slack, and I was like, oh, I might use that one day. But I had to dig to really verify that because I was not sure. I checked Stack Overflow, and there were messages that said, oh, like it's actually 2.0, and some people are saying, oh, as of this version, it's actually this. But there was no reference back to it. So I really had to do a lot of digging to really find that out.
The official
so that was a lot of
GitHub
fun.
says version 4.
Is
So-
there an
There you go.
official GitHub?
Yeah, I just linked it.
Oh, interesting. So I downloaded it from Apple's opensource.apple.com, which is not GitHub.
Oh, it says, yeah.
Interesting.
Oh, yeah, this is an unofficial mirror.
Unofficial mirror. Yeah, I got too excited.
Yeah.
So once again, I fooled you, but I look forward to next week where you might make a comeback. It's always going to be a matter of time until I start losing episode after episode. So I'm going to enjoy my winning streak so far. So with that, I want to personally thank everyone for watching live and listening in this week. As always, I want to also I want to also thank our co-hosts this week for taking time, especially after we couldn't necessarily record on time, to still make it happen, so that way we have an episode for everyone. So we'll be streaming every Friday, hopefully. So be sure to follow us on Twitter at Code Completion, so that way you know when new episodes go live and get released. Be sure to also sign up for our monthly newsletter at our website at codecompletion.io, where we'll recap the topics that we discussed. And we actually shared one of the articles that was from our first episode where we discuss difficult data sources and compositional layouts as an article. So we'll be sharing those on Twitter and sharing those in our newsletter. So be sure to sign up for that if you want to learn more about what we talk about on the show. So with that, I want to give my thanks to Fernando, who is at From Junior to Senior on Twitter. I want to thank Johnny, who's at Johnny D. Hicks on Twitter, and Spencer, who's at Spencer C. Curtis on Twitter. And once again, my name is Dimitri, and you can find me at Dimitri Bouniol, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
Hey guys.